Morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are as you might take the time to listen to my reflections. We're going to speak about the welcoming prayer practice, an active spiritual practice developed early on by Contemplative Outreach, particularly by the late Mary Morosky, who was a very close associate of Father Thomas Keating's. And in presenting that practice, Father Thomas would always want us to offer to the folks sufficient conceptual background that will ultimately support the practice in ordinary life, daily life, so to speak. And so I would just want us for a moment to recall Father Thomas Keating's teaching on true self, false self as a paradigm that helps to describe the human condition. And as you know, Father Thomas leaned very heavily on Thomas Merton, a fellow Trappist, who used that paradigm of true self, false self in many of his writings. From Thomas Merton's point of view, the true self is that self that is known and loved and affirmed by God from all eternity. It is the deepest source of our identity. Our true self is the reflection of the image and the likeness of God that we are and have been from all eternity. The seeds of our identity arise from within the awareness of our true self. And our false self, according to Thomas Merton, is that external self, that whole-made self, that self-made self, that false self. Well, what Father Thomas Keating did in developing or further developing the teaching of Thomas Merton was to identify three sources that contribute to the building up of the false self system. Father Thomas Keating would certainly accept the way in which Thomas Merton described the true self, as I've just offered to you. But then he went on to identify three sources that contribute to the building up of the false self. And the first internal source is our over-identification with our emotional programs for happiness, our exaggerated demand for power, control, our exaggerated demand for affection, esteem, approval, or our exaggerated demand for security. Father Thomas would go on to point out that when we come to full self-conscious awareness, we do so without a corresponding felt sense of the presence of God. So as a way of coping with that feeling of isolation or that feeling of separateness, we begin to develop emotional programs for happiness as a way of coping with that feeling of separateness or that feeling of isolation. And then he added two external sources that help to reinforce this false self system. And one external source would be our exaggerated over-identification with the predominant values of the culture in which we live, cultural conditioning, in other words. And the second external source would be our unreflective acceptance of the demands of authority. So those three sources help to develop what Father Thomas Keating would describe as our false self system. And then in a very, very concrete way, Father Thomas raises a question. And the question is simply this: how do you and I know when one or other of our emotional programs for happiness is acting out? And he goes on to answer his own question by simply saying anytime we experience the upsurge of our afflictive emotions, our anger, our rage, our anxiety, our fear, our envy, our jealousy, our lust, anytime we feel the intensity, and intensity is the buzzword, anytime we feel the intensity of these afflictive emotions, we become aware that our false self, one or other of our emotional programs or a combination of the three, is beginning to make its presence felt. And so the welcoming prayer practice is an active spiritual practice that helps us, really helps us in daily life to begin to disidentify with our over-identification with our emotional programs for happiness. These programs for happiness that I've described are very much in place at an early stage in our growth and development. We become so used to them that it's probably hard or difficult to imagine life without them. But these are emotional programs for happiness that simply do not work and only continue to create within us a sense of frustration or ongoing struggle. And so I've always said early on that in the context of our spiritual journey and in seeking to disidentify with this false self system, we need to integrate, again in a both and way, the spiritual practices of centering prayer, and then this active spiritual practice we describe as the welcoming prayer practice. It's a both and, they complement one another. The welcoming prayer helps us to continue the good work that God has begun and God continues to sustain during our contemplative practice of centering prayer. And so what I'd like to do for just a few moments is to help us in a very practical and very concrete way to become more aware of how we are being invited to disidentify with, not to judge, but to simply disidentify with the pulling of these emotional programs for happiness. If we really want to be free to be ourselves, it's essential that we begin to take on this active work of disidentifying with these emotional programs for happiness. And so the welcoming prayer practice is a process. And it's a process of what is described as a willingness to focus into the afflictive emotion precisely where we carry that emotion within our body. In that sense, it's a very physical prayer. So we are invited to focus, to sink into the emotion precisely where we carry it in our body. For myself, as I've shared for so many years, it is in my gut that I experience the rising up of these afflictive emotions anytime there is an external catalyst that calls forth one or other of my emotional programs for happiness. And so the first step in the process, and feel process, don't think too much, feel process, focus, sink in. And as you focus and sink into the emotion, the felt emotion, the second step in the process is to welcome to really welcome. And we're inviting one another to welcome the presence within our body of this afflictive emotion. Welcome anger, welcome fear, welcome envy, welcome justice, and simultaneously and intentionally, we are also inviting the presence of God, or acknowledging the presence of God within these afflictive emotions. So focus, sink in, welcome, welcome, welcome the presence of God within the experience of our anger, our rage, our afflictive emotion. Again, for many of us, a huge step. And then the final part of the process is the letting go. And intentionally, we silently repeat our willingness to let go of our, in this situation, in this present moment, our willingness to let go of, excuse me, to let go of our exaggerated demand for power, control, affection, esteem, approval, security. So that's the process. And what I'd like to do now, to give us an actual experience, is to lead us through the practice, through what I describe as a guided meditation. And so I want to encourage us to allow ourselves the freedom just to relax, to take a few deep breaths, breathe in through the nose, fill the diaphragm, exhale through the nose, a few deep breaths. And then I want to encourage us to be aware of a soft light at the very top of our head. And I want to invite us now to allow that soft light to begin to penetrate, to permeate, if you will, our head, our facial muscles, allowing this soft light now to descend to our neck. And as we experience this gentle bodily scan, I want to invite you to notice within your body, within your physicality or your psyche, any areas of tension or tightness. You may want to use this material for the welcoming prayer practice. And now allow this soft, penetrating light to move down through your shoulders, into your arms, your elbow, finally into your hands and fingers. And again, the invitation is to be aware of any points of tension that you're feeling through this bodily scan. And now allow this light to return to the area of your neck and continue to move down through your body, through your lungs, through your diaphragm, your stomach, and again, just to notice, to be aware of points or pockets of tension, anxiety, no judgment, and awareness of the presence of these interior areas of tension or tightness. And now allow the light, this soft penetrating light, to continue down through the genital area, your thighs, your knees, your legs, and now into your feet and your toes. And so once again, through this bodily scan, you are simply being invited to be aware of the presence of any inner tightness, blockage, tension that you may feel. Just to be aware. And as I mentioned earlier, you may want to use that material as we move into our spiritual practice. Now, another way that I've found helpful in leading people into the experience of the welcoming prayer is to recall St. Ignatius's invitation at different moments in our lives to call upon what he describes as our graced memory. And so now in this moment, through the exercise of your graced memory, I want to invite you to recall a particularly upsetting event or experience that took place in your life in the recent past. And as you recall that upsetting experience as an external catalyst, I want to invite you to allow yourself to feel in this present moment the intensity of whatever emotions or feelings arose for you during that upsetting experience. To bring this experience with all of its affectivity into the present moment through the exercise of your graced memory. And so now, as we choose to enter into the practice of our welcoming prayer, I invite you to look at those bodily physical reactions that you may have experienced through your bodily scan. Or I invite you to the experience of your graced memory to allow that upsetting event to be very present now in this moment, to be very aware of the intensity of one or other of your afflictive emotions. And so now, as we embrace the practice of centering prayer, as we embrace the practice of the welcoming prayer intentionally, I invite you to focus and to sink into the afflictive emotion or emotions precisely where you are carrying them in your body. Focus, sink into these afflictive emotions precisely where you carry them in your body. Focus, sink in. Focus, sink in to the afflictive emotion or emotions precisely where you carry them in your body. And now, as part of our prayerful process, I invite you to welcome, to intentionally welcome the presence of your afflictive emotion, be it anger, envy, jealousy, anxiety, fear. Welcome the afflictive emotion or emotions. And now simultaneously, in a both-and kind of way, I also want to invite you to consent or to welcome the presence of God within those afflictive emotions or emotion. Welcome, welcome, welcome both simultaneously, the emotion itself and the presence of God within that emotion. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And now, as the final part of our process, I invite you to embrace the letting go experience. And so interiorly, we are choosing in this moment to let go of our exaggerated demand for power, control, affection, esteem, approval, security. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And I let go, finally, of my desire to change the situation in which I find myself in this moment. Welcome, welcome, welcome.